Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of people get confused. It's authentication versus authorization.
Mhm.
Two terms that, yeah, they sound similar, but they're actually super important for pretty much everything we do online.
That's right.
You've probably heard these terms before, maybe at work when you're talking about security, or maybe when you're setting up like a new app on your phone. But what we're going to be doing today in our deep dive is really mapping this out, how it all works, what it means for you, and even where things might be headed in the future.
Mm,
So think of it like this. Authentication is like proving you are who you say you are. It's like showing your ID to get into a club.
right.
But then authorization is about what you can do once you're inside. Can you access the VIP area? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
It all depends on what you're authorized to do.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And it highlights why both are so essential for a secure system. You really can't have one without the other.
Exactly. So let's dive into the definitions a little bit more, and then we'll explore how it all works in the real world, especially in the cloud, where things get really interesting. Can you break down authentication and authorization for us?
Sure. So authentication, which is often shortened to just AuthN, it's all about verifying an identity. Think of it as confirming that something is genuine. And this actually isn't just for websites and apps. Art experts use authentication to verify that a painting is really by a famous artist. And even governments use it to prevent money counterfeiting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so it's a lot more widespread than I initially thought. I can see why it's so important to get it right.
Absolutely. Now, authorization, or AuthZ, this focuses on what a verified user can actually do. It's about permissions and access levels. Going back to your club analogy, everyone inside has been authenticated, they've shown their ID, but only some are authorized to access that VIP area.
Okay, right. That makes sense. And this is where our source material provides a really good example. They talk about a coffee shop, and you've got different employees, all with different roles and levels of access.
Exactly. The manager might be able to see sales data and even change prices. But then the barista can only take orders. They're both authenticated employees, but their authorization levels differ.
Okay, so authentication comes first, and then authorization determines what you can do. But how do you actually prove your identity in the first place? Our source material digs into the three main ways this happens. What's the most common one that we probably use every day?
It's probably the one that you use most often. Something you know, like a password, a PIN, or even those security questions about your first pet's name or something like that.
Oh yeah, the dreaded security questions. I always forget those answers.
Yeah.
But I guess that's why there's more than one way to authenticate, right?
Right. There's also something you have. This could be a physical object, like a security token. Or it could be your phone receiving a one-time code. The source points out that this is good because it adds a layer of security. Because even if someone gets your password, they can't get in without that second factor.
Okay, yeah. That makes me feel a little bit better about all those security breaches we hear about. Okay, so we've got something you know
Yeah.
and something you have. What's that third one?
Something you are.
Something you are.
Biometrics.
Oh,
Fingerprints, facial recognition, even iris scans. You probably use this every day to unlock your phone. But things are getting even more advanced. The source material mentions things like behavioral biometrics.
behavioral biometrics. That sounds like straight out of a sci-fi movie. How does that even work?
Yeah. It analyzes patterns in how you type, swipe, or even walk to verify your identity. It's all about looking at unique individual traits to confirm you are who you say you are.
So it's not just about what you know or have, but also how you behave digitally. It's incredible how authentication is evolving.
It really is. And these different factors are often used in combination. Like when you need both a password and a code sent to your phone to log in, that's called multi-factor authentication, and it's becoming increasingly common.
Right, which makes sense given all the security risks we face online. But, okay, we've spent a good chunk of time on authentication. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the different types of authorization. What's the most common type?
One very common type is access control lists, or ACLs. These are basically sets of rules that determine who can access what resources. You can think of it like a digital bouncer enforcing the rules of who gets in where.
So different users get different levels of access, depending on their roles.
Exactly. Think about it with your own experience at work. You might have access to certain files in a shared project, but your manager has a different set of permissions. And the IT team has the highest level of access. That's ACLs in action. It's all about ensuring the right people have the right level of access.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great way to visualize it. It makes me think about how critical authorization is for data sensitivity. After all, not all information is created equal.
Absolutely. The source uses a good example of a company website. Some information is public, some is for employees only, and then there's top secret stuff only a few people can see. Proper authorization ensures that information stays compartmentalized and only accessible to the right people.
Right. It's like a series of digital vaults with different levels of security clearance. Speaking of which, the source uses a great analogy to explain the difference between authentication and authorization. They talk about visiting a friend's house. Your friend recognizing you at the door, that's authentication. But being allowed in the kitchen but not in their private office, that's authorization.
Right. It's such a simple analogy, but it really brings the concept down to earth.
Exactly. It makes it much easier to grasp. So we've covered the basics of authentication and authorization, their different types, and some real-world examples. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The source dives into how these concepts are crucial for cloud security, something we all use every day without even realizing it.
That's a great point. Cloud computing relies heavily on both processes to function securely. It's like having your own secure digital locker in a giant shared warehouse.
Okay, yeah, I'm hooked. Let's unpack this cloud security piece after a quick break.
Sounds good. So before the break, we were talking about authentication and authorization in the cloud. What makes it so different from, say, logging into our email?
Well, think about it this way. With cloud computing, you have tons of users, all sharing the same platform, accessing all sorts of services like this giant digital city. And security is super important to keep things organized and, safe. The source uses a great analogy. It's like this giant warehouse filled with digital lockers, each one holding someone's data.
I like that. A giant warehouse. That's a good image. It really highlights why both authentication and authorization are so important, especially in this, what the source calls it, shared resource model.
Right, exactly. So when you log into your cloud service, whether it's for file storage, email, or anything else, you're first proving who you are. That's authentication in action, just like we talked about before.
Exactly. But here's where authorization takes center stage. Once you're in, the system needs to make absolutely sure that you only access your stuff, your designated locker, in that warehouse.
Right. Makes sense. You wouldn't want someone just like poking around in your files or accessing your sensitive information, right?
Absolutely not. That's where authorization is so important. It's like a super organized librarian, making sure that everyone stays in their designated section, and they can only access what they're supposed to.
Okay, that makes sense. I get it. But what happens if these security measures fail? What are the implications then, especially for something like the cloud?
That's a really good question. And it's something that the source really grapples with. We should all be thinking about this, because if authentication fails, it means someone could be impersonating you, getting into your accounts, stealing your data.
Right.
And if authorization fails, well, then someone could be granted access to information they shouldn't have, which could lead to data breaches and all sorts of chaos.
Yeah, that's kind of scary, actually, when you put it that way. It's not just about losing a password. It's about, losing control of your entire digital life.
And it's not just individuals. Think about the implications for businesses and organizations. If their cloud security fails, they could lose sensitive customer data, financial records, trade secrets. It could be devastating.
So it's not just about convenience and accessibility. It's also about trust and responsibility. Cloud providers need to be held accountable for ensuring the security of our data.
Absolutely. And it's a constant battle. Hackers and cybercriminals are always finding new ways to exploit vulnerabilities. Cloud providers really have to constantly up their game to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they do. And this brings up an interesting point from the source material. They talk about the potential downsides of cloud computing's shared resource model. Like, it's great for accessibility and collaboration, but it also creates a single point of failure.
Right. If the security of the platform is compromised, it could impact everyone.
Wow.
That's a lot of trust we're putting in these providers.
It really is. It makes me think about the choices we make as individuals. Like, which providers do we trust? What level of security are we comfortable with? These are questions we should all be asking ourselves.
I agree. And the source emphasizes it's not just about the technology, it's also about user awareness and best practices. We have a responsibility to protect our own data as well.
Absolutely. Things like using strong passwords, being careful about what links we click, enabling multi-factor authentication. Like, we have to be proactive about our own digital security.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility. Cloud providers need to provide those robust security measures, and we as users need to be informed and vigilant.
Okay, so we've covered the importance of authentication and authorization in the cloud, and the risks if things go wrong. But let's circle back to a term you mentioned earlier, access control. The source talks about this as the muscle behind authorization. Can you explain what they mean by that?
Of course. So we talked about how authorization sets the rules for who can access what. Access control is the mechanism that actually enforces those rules. Think of it as the bouncer at the door of that digital locker we were talking about, checking your credentials, making sure you're allowed in.
Okay, so it's like the last line of defense.
Yeah, precisely. It's what prevents unauthorized access, even if someone manages to bypass earlier security measures. It could involve things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, or even something as simple as requiring a password to access a file.
So it sounds like access control plays a role in both the physical and digital world.
It does, absolutely. It's the final checkpoint, ensuring that only authorized individuals can access sensitive information or resources.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these concepts, authentication, authorization, and access control, they're all connected. It's like this layered security system.
Exactly. They all work together to create a much more robust defense against unauthorized access.
And it's clear that this layered approach is essential, especially in today's digital landscape where the threats are constantly evolving.
Absolutely. We're in this constant arms race with cybercriminals, and staying ahead of the curve requires a multifaceted approach. It includes technology, policies, and user education.
And speaking of user education, this deep dive has been so enlightening for me. I feel like I have a much clearer understanding of all of this now.
Well, that's great to hear. It's always rewarding to be able to break down these complex topics and make them accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I agree. It's like gaining a new lens through which to view the digital world. It makes you appreciate the intricate systems working behind the scenes to protect our data and keep us safe online.
It really is fascinating, and it highlights how important it is to stay informed and engaged with these issues. The more we understand about how these systems work, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and advocate for stronger security measures.
Well said. So we've covered the basics, explored the cloud, and even touched on the potential downsides of these shared systems.
Oh.
But the source also hints at the future of authentication and authorization. I'm curious to know where things might be headed. Let's dive into that. Let's
Yeah.
dive into that future of authentication and authorization.
Okay.
Feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, it's true. This field is constantly evolving, especially with technology advancing so fast.
Right, exactly. And the source material even hints at some really cool advancements that are coming. Like, remember those passwords and security questions we were talking about? It seems like those might be on their way out.
Yeah, you're right. The source mentions this trend towards passwordless authentication, which honestly sounds pretty great. I'm sure you're tired of remembering those complex passwords just as much as I am.
Oh, tell me about it. But what would passwordless authentication even look like? Like, how would we prove who we are without a password?
Well, think about biometrics. We already use fingerprints and facial recognition to unlock our phones. Passwordless authentication just takes this a step further. Imagine logging into your bank account with just a glance or a touch.
Okay, yeah. That would be so convenient. But is it safe? Would it be as safe as traditional passwords?
Well, that's the big question, and it's something the source explores in detail. The argument is that biometrics, especially when you combine them with other factors like location or behavioral patterns, can actually be more secure than passwords. After all, you can't forget or misplace your fingerprint.
That's true. That's a really good point. And the source also mentions something called behavioral biometrics, which, again, sounds super futuristic. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, so it's basically analyzing those unique patterns and how you interact with your devices. So the way you type, how you swipe on your phone, even the pressure you apply to the screen, all of these things can be used to verify your identity.
Oh, wow. So it's like your own personal, unique digital fingerprint.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like the future of authentication. It's all about moving away from things we know, like passwords, or things we have, like a physical token, and more towards who we are, how we behave. Our digital identities are becoming a lot more personal and unique.
Exactly. And this actually ties into another trend that the source talks about, AI-powered risk assessment.
AI and security.
Yeah,
That sounds intense.
it is. But imagine a system that is constantly analyzing your online activity. It's looking for anything suspicious. So if it detects something out of the ordinary, like an unusual login location, or maybe a sudden change in your spending habits, it can trigger additional security measures.
So it's like having a personal security guard,
Yeah,
monitoring your digital life, looking out for any threats.
exactly. It's using technology to proactively identify and mitigate risks.
Wow, okay. It's pretty amazing to think about all the advancements happening, but I have to ask, what does all of this mean for us, for the everyday users? What should we be thinking about as these technologies become more common?
That's a great question. I think the key takeaway here is that as authentication and authorization become more sophisticated, we need to stay informed. We need to understand how these technologies work, what data they collect, and how that data is being used.
So it's not just about blindly trusting these systems, it's about being aware and making informed choices about our own digital security.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive. We have explored the fundamentals of authentication and authorization. We've discussed how they play a crucial role in cloud security, and even took a peek into the future of these really important processes. So a huge thank you to our expert for breaking all of this down,
You're welcome.
and to our listeners for joining us on this journey. As always, we encourage you to keep learning and stay curious, because when it comes to digital security, knowledge really is power. Until next time, stay safe, everyone.